Hello, and welcome to this tutorial on GV Director Composer. GV Director Composer is a graphics animation and compositing application that can run on a Mac or PC Workstation. With Composer, you can create static or animated 2D and 3D effects and mixer transitions for GV Director, allowing you to design the look and feel of your live production. I should emphasize that Composer is a compositing tool. It allows you to build up layers of graphics and animate them, but it's not a graphics design tool like, say, Photoshop, although it will import files from your industry standard graphics applications to use for authoring. This tutorial is aimed at someone getting started with the Composer application. If you would like to delve deeper into the operations, then more detailed instructions can be found in the user manual. My name's Adrian Shepherd, and in this training I will begin with launching the software, looking over the welcome window and the application preferences before going on to create a new project and take a tour around the interface. Next, I'll open a simple project and look at how basic transitions and effects are put together. We will then use that knowledge as a base to build an effect and some transitions from scratch, create a compound element, and export those as a production pack to our GV Director system. Finally, we will look at importing a full production pack that contains many effects and transitions, and discuss the best ways to modify these existing graphics to match your station or production look and feel. So let's get started. When you first launch Composer, you will first see this welcome window. Here you can open a project, create a new project, and import a project. At this point, it's important to understand the difference between a Composer project and a production pack. The GV Director system only works with production packs. These contain all the effects and transition information compressed into a single file, and it uses the extension .ppk. You can have multiple production packs loaded on the GV Director server and switch between them, so each show can have its own unique look and feel. A production pack is exported from Composer, but it's not the native format for Composer projects. A Composer project consists of a number of files and folders which you can open up at the Finder level. So a production pack is a bit like a compressed or zipped version of a Composer project. If you want to modify a production pack from GV Director, then you can import it into Composer using the Import Project button here. Another thing to note is that Composer is designed to work with several Grass Valley products, not just GV Director. For example, under the Import Project, it offers TXMAM database as a source. That refers to the K2Edge playout system only. And here, if I select New Project, I can choose the project type to be either K2Edge or GV Director. You must always choose GV Director. When we create a new project, you can see the format has already been set, i.e. the frame size, aspect ratio, frame rate, etc. The format is set in Preferences. So let's back up a minute and cancel the New Project dialog, go back to the Welcome window, and we'll select Preferences. There are several tabs to the Preferences. Most are extremely straightforward, so I'll just highlight the less obvious settings. Starting with the Nexus tab, and at the top here is where we select the format for the project. There are the usual formats here of 1080i, 720p, and PAL and NTSC. Note that if you change the format, or indeed any of the settings on the Nexus tab, you will have to restart the application, as it says here in the dialog box. In addition to this, if you open an existing project or import a project which is of a different format to the settings, then you will have to restart to match the format setting. Multi-sampling anti-aliasing is used to improve the quality, particularly on edges. The downside is the higher the sample setting, the more it will impact the performance of the application. The player's big buffer pool size could be increased if you have a project with a high number of HD players and the playback is starting to fail. Texture cache size. A higher cache size improves the performance, but note that not all graphics cards have sufficient RAM. Deinterlacing method, and this applies to preview in Composer and doesn't affect playback. Weave is the default, and this is when consecutive fields are added together and all lines are shown. For animations, this can result in combing artifacts and cause jagged edges. The first field only option can be used to avoid combing effects. Keep in mind that for interlaced content, half of the field's lines are then missing. Next, the File tab. This sets the default project folder location. In this case, it's set to my Documents folder, then Composer Projects. You can enable and set the autosave frequency on this tab too. The History tab just sets the number of actions tracked in history, i.e. how many levels of undo you have. Guides. Here you can set the colour and snap distance of guidelines. Grid is where you can set a different colour for grid lines and set the spacing. The Backup System tab allows you to set the number of backups to keep. And lastly, the Networking tab specifies the FTP transfer mode to be either passive or active. So let's begin with creating a test project at 1080i50. I make sure the type is set to GV Director. Give the project a name, say Test 1080-50i, not original I know. The project will, by default, save to my Documents folder in a Composer Projects folder. Now we are in the application, let's take a brief tour around the interface. At the top, we have a toolbar that provides quick access to a number of tools. There are some for the stage, the tryout mode, to be able to switch between 2D and 3D handles, lock your aspect ratio, or add an object. In the middle, the large empty window is the stage, which has been formatted to match our project setting. Here is where we build and preview our graphics. Below the stage is a timeline where we can keyframe the objects on stage to animate, say, the size, the position, the transparency, etc. On either side of the stage and timeline are windows that can be moved and changed according to your own requirements. Let's talk through the default layout first. On the left, we have two windows. The lower shows the history of actions, so we can quickly perform an undo or redo. Control or Command Z, etc. works too. Above the history is our Object Selection pane, where we can add different types of objects to the stage, such as shapes, imported graphics, text, and players, and they allow you to add media to the stage, such as stills, video, or audio clips. Over on the right, there's a project window with 3 default folders that will be used to manage the project content. Templates and effects go together, as templates are the building blocks from which we can create an effect. Templates contain the actual objects and the animation information. So, for example, one template might contain a logo graphic that's been imported into Composer and is then animated to fade onto screen. This would be the fade on action for a logo effect. You could then have a second template that is the reverse, a fade off action. Both these templates or actions go to make up the complete logo effect. Transitions are different from templates and effects as they are built as a single item. Along the top of the window are the buttons where we can add a new transition, new template, and new effect to our project. There are two more buttons here for more complex graphics, an animated transition and a compound element. The animated transition is used when we want to include an animation or short video or ticker as part of the transition. A good example of this would be, say, a flash wipe, which is basically a mix between A and B with some bright specular animation playing in the foreground. A compound element is completely different from the other items here in that it allows you to combine transitions and effects with placeholders for live feeds and shotbox clips all together in a single element. In fact, creating a compound element is similar to setting up the stage on the GV Director touchpad, except you can prepare even more complex compound elements in Composer that have multiple events. When you open a compound element, the Composer interface changes to reveal a compound element timeline to drag elements to, as you see here. An example of a compound element is when you need a source background to appear with certain effects and using a certain transition. Say, a golf leaderboard always appears with camera 1 behind and uses a 3D cube transition. Lastly, below the project window is the Object Parameters window. Once we have some objects added to the stage, we will see the parameters here and we can make adjustments for each object. Parameters are things like size, position, opacity, colour, etc. As I mentioned earlier, the windows around the stage can be changed to suit your own layout. To access any of the windows and enable or disable them, go to the top to the View menu and then Windows. All the windows you see here can be resized and moved around, and they can be undocked by clicking this icon, the double square icon here, and stacked together by dropping one on top of another. Like we have with the Object and Assets window here, you can see there are tabs at the bottom of this pane to switch between the two windows. And if I drop the Project window on top, then we now have all three stacked together. The last thing for Windows is that you can hide all of them at once by going back to the View menu and selecting Clean View Mode. Next, let's look at how we build a simple effect. As I discussed before, an effect is going to have at least one on action, which makes the graphic appear on screen, and at least one off action when the graphic is removed from the screen. Actually, let me open a project I created earlier so you can see what we are aiming for. In this project, you can see I have 3 transitions, 3 templates, and a lower third effect. If I double click the lower third effect, then in the Object Properties window, you can see how the effect is built from the 3 templates above, and that these templates are assigned as actions. This effect is unusual in that it not only has the standard on and off action, but it has an alternative mix off action that can be used instead of the default off action. Let's look at the template that's been used to make the default on action, the lower third in template. If I double click it, it loads into the template timeline. At the moment, the stage is zoomed in too far to see all the objects, so let's click in the toolbar on the Fit button. There are zoom in and out controls here too, and a zoom drop-down selection. If I play the timeline, we can see the animation. The Curtains button in the toolbar puts a black mask around the edge of the active stage area to simulate viewing on a monitor. One more very useful button here, which we'll use in a minute, is the Tryout button. Tryout mode differs from playing back the timeline in that it allows you to check one template after another to check the actions. Furthermore, streaming players like clips, animations, audio, etc. will only work in the tryout mode. Down in the timeline, I can rewind, play, and pause. With the timeline position indicator here, I can use the frame count to jog forwards or backwards. On the left of the timeline, we see the objects in the template. Each object has its own timeline track. In this case, the objects are being grouped, so if I click to expand the group, I can see the objects within it. In this case, there's some text, that's the Grass Valley text, and a box with a gradient as the background. You might have noticed that the object window at the top left also displays the objects in the selected template. Here I can set the layer order for the objects simply by dragging them up or down in the list. Back in the timeline, the black line here indicates a transition between two keyframes. A keyframe is a snapshot of the object parameters at that point in time, and the system will automatically create an animation between successive keyframes. If I double-click the last keyframe, then the object properties show up, and if I expand the transform properties, we can then see that the Y position changes as I jog the timeline. The little red outlines here indicate a keyframe has been set. Here is the Add Keyframe button in the timeline. This will add a keyframe for all properties, whether they are modified or not. You can insert or delete an individual property keyframe here next to each property. The Start keyframe for the lower third group has the Y position set to 1160. And if I use the Go to Next keyframe, then the End keyframe and finishing position is Y equals 895. With a keyframe highlighted, I could change some parameters and click on the keyframe button to update the keyframe. Let's talk about scene parameters next. This is when you can set a property in Composer as a variable. So when using the effect in GV Director, you have to set that variable before using it on air. In GV Director, the effect icon will show a yellow warning triangle at the top corner. Text would typically be assigned a scene parameter, for example the words Grass Valley in this lower third. You may want to keep the background gradient and have the option to change the text to another name. You can see a scene parameter has been added to this template because it too has yellow warning symbols in the object window, and with the text object selected, we see the yellow warnings in the object properties. If I click here and go to Link to Scene Parameter, then you can create a new parameter or select one that's already created. This parameter name is the one that shows up in the GV Director panel, so your scene parameter names should be self-explicit so the operator knows what to enter. I'm going to load my lower third out template next and play it in the timeline. And you see it is the reverse action of the in template. This was easy to achieve because there are some useful commands in the timeline. First, if I take the in template, I can duplicate it using the button here. Then right-click in the timeline to select all the keyframes. And I do this via Object Keyframes, Select, then All. Then go to the Tools button and choose Reverse Keyframes. And there I have a template that performs the opposite action of the original. It was easy. Duplicating the in template also ensures the out template refers to exactly the same objects as the in. If it didn't, then the out wouldn't remove the objects from the screen. They would be left there forever. As it's important to know which objects are associated with which template or transition, Composer tracks all the objects in the project, and you can see them all too. You go to the Objects pane, and the filter symbol at the top right of the box is filtering which objects are active in this template. If I click to not filter the display, then I will see all the objects in my project. For example, the IPA mixer here, which is used for my transitions and is normally hidden from this template. Let's quickly look at a transition before I show you the tryout mode. I'll load the Mix transition to the timeline. Notice the object on the timeline is called an IPA mixer. This is a built-in software mixer in Composer. All objects in a transition should be grouped under the mixer object. All transitions default to 100 frame duration. If I play the timeline, then you can see the red A channel fades out to reveal the blue B channel. The idea of the transition is that you start with 100% front A channel showing and finish with 100% B channel showing. In the mix transition, if we look at the last keyframe, the opacity of the A channel has been set to go from 100% to 0. Similarly, with the slide transition, let me select it and play it through first. Then click on the last keyframe, and this time you can see in the properties that it's the X position only that's been keyframed, as that is the only property to have a red keyframe indicator. OK, now we have seen how the templates and transitions are constructed, let's see how they look in the tryout mode. Down the bottom right, we see a new tryout window appears. If I double-click my lower third in template, then you see the graphic appears on screen. And if I double-click the lower third out next, and the graphic goes back off screen. So these are the standard on and off actions for my lower third effect. Let me bring it back on again, and this time use the lower third mix out template. So that's an alternative off action that the GV Director operator could use by calling it up in the effect actions. The lower third mix out template was created by duplicating the in template, then changing the keyframing to alter the opacity instead of the position. Earlier, I said we could build a simple effect from scratch. Well, now you've seen how an effect is put together, I think we could give this a go. Let's create a promo box effect with 2 lines of text. I'll first add an effect to my project and right-click to rename it. I'll call it promo box. Then I add a template for the in. I'll call this promo box in. And I'll double-click the template to load the empty template to the timeline. For my promo box, I want a background graphic and a logo graphic. I also want a specific font, so I'll first add these to my project assets. The Project Assets window can, by default, be found stacked at the bottom right with the object properties. You can see the types of media we can import from the organisational icons in the asset window. If I click on the fonts icon, you can see that a new project has no fonts in the library. I should mention an important point here. In Composer, each project requires its own set of fonts to be imported. This is because when you export the project as a production pack, it will export absolutely everything needed to recreate the graphics, and that includes the fonts. By restricting the fonts to just those we use, we can save on file space. So let's import the font I want for my promo box. I click on the Add Files Plus button. I have a folder with assets ready to import here. The font is called Big Noodle Titling, which seems a nice name for a font. I'm on a Windows system, so if the font was already present in my Fonts folder, then I would first have to go to my Control Panel and Fonts, then save it out to a regular folder or to the desktop, like this. I can't import the font directly from the System Fonts folder. I need to import two graphics too. One will be my background and the other is a GV logo. Out of interest, here is the list of files Composer supports. It shows Targa and BMP for stills, TrueType fonts, video, audio, animation formats, and 3D mesh clips. By the way, the Targa files should be 32-bit uncompressed, and the BMP 24-bit uncompressed. Also, and this is important, when you create your graphics, you should just use an image size big enough for the actual graphic. There's absolutely no need to create a full HD image where, say, 90% is transparent. This just takes up more space in your production pack and wastes server resources when it's loaded for use. This is one of the most common mistakes made when creating Composer effects. Anyway, we now have our graphics loaded in the library too. If I want to use the graphics straight away, then I can in fact drag them directly from the library to the stage and resize them and position them the way I want them to look in their final position on the screen. I can, of course, set my layer order in the object window or by right-clicking the object on the stage. Now, I want to add 2 lines of text to my promo box, and I do this using the plus button in my Objects window or the Add Object button in the toolbar. The Add Object selection opens, and let me just talk you through some of the objects we can use here. The library consists of graphical objects like planes, spheres, 3D boxes, and 3D cylinders. And then there are players too. Players allow you to work with media clips like animation sequences, audio, video clips, and live video. These are just placeholders, and of course stills. GV Director will work with any of the objects in the Composer library, but if you are adding several complex layers to a template, then it's always best practice to check the effect performance in GV Director itself as an integral part of your authoring workflow. You can carry out these checks using the load meter displayed on the top of the GV Director touchpad. Here I will add 2 single-line text boxes. I can copy and paste the first text box in the Objects window if I like. You see, it creates a text to object. And I'll resize the text boxes to fit the promo background. Now, as I resize the box, you see the text is resized too. But if I want to use the correct font size and scaling, I need to open my text player properties and click on the Copy from Transform gizmo here. You see the text rescale back to its proper size. While I'm here, I'll change the text to say promo top line. I'll do the same for the lower text box too. Set the scaling and change the text to promo bottom line. I will select the top line again and set my text alignment to be centered. And I want to use the Big Noodle titling font. So to change the font, I go to the Custom Style font and I'll size it to 110 point. I'm going to set a drop shadow too. Now I'll do the same for the bottom line, but make the text size a bit smaller. I'll make it 65 point and give it the same drop shadow look too. Now when creating an effect, I'm generally going to want to have all the objects changed together. So to make life easier, I will group them. I do this in the Object window by Control or Command clicking to highlight all the objects. Then right-click and select Group. Now in the timeline, I have a single item to keyframe. I can of course drill down into the group to individual objects and keyframe those separately if I want to. So with all my objects set up at the final position, let me add a keyframe at 1 second and another at the beginning of the timeline. Now if I make sure the start keyframe is highlighted, then I can change one of the group properties. I could fade the promo box in, or I could slide it in from below, but in this case I want to fade it in and rotate it at the same time. So I will adjust the X rotation to 90 degrees and set the opacity to 0 for this start keyframe. Then click on the keyframe button again, which will update it with the changed settings. So playing the timeline, I can now see the animation between the start and end keyframes. Now the animation between keyframes is currently set to constant speed, but I might want it to slow down at the end of the animation, so I would select my starting keyframe and set it to ease out. And playing the timeline again, that looks better. Now I've made the text in the promo box generic text because I don't want it to be fixed, so I'm going to make it a variable parameter. And to do this, I select my text object, then click on the triangle next to the text entry box in Properties and choose Link to Scene Parameter. I'll create a new parameter and call it Promo Top Line. And you can see the yellow warning triangle comes up to tell me that I have a variable parameter set. I can of course do the same for the promo bottom line text. Now I've finished with my in template. I want to create an out template, and the easiest way to do this is to duplicate the in template, then rename it to out, and I can bring up the rename dialog by double clicking the tab. Next, in the timeline, I select all keyframes. And in the Timeline Tools menu, select Reverse Keyframes. Remember that duplicating the In template also ensures the Out template refers to the same objects as the In, so the objects are correctly removed from the screen. Let's see how that looks. One more thing, the template for the Out action will continue playing forever unless we enable an out point. Having an out point is very important. To do this, I place the playhead downstream of the second keyframe. Make sure that I have the group highlighted. Right-click the timeline and select Enable Out Point. So with our In and Out templates ready, I can now add them to the effect actions. I double-click my promo box effect in the project window to bring up its properties, and right-click in the template column for the On action. And I'll choose Set Template and select my promo box In template. I do the same for the Off action. And there we are done. The effect is ready to be exported from Composer as part of a production pack and use in GV Director. Let's have a look at our templates working together now. I can only see this in the tryout mode. There's our promo box In template. And to remove the objects from screen again, I double-click the Out template. Next, let's add a couple of transitions to my Composer project. I click on the Add Transition button and then right-click to rename it. This will be a mix transition. The transition loads in the timeline with the IPA mixer already set up with a front and back plane. The front plane, my red A screen, will be filled with the outgoing video in GV Director, and the back plane, which if I hide the front plane using the little eye viewer control, is a blue B screen. This represents my incoming video for the transition. To create the mix, I'll just keyframe the front plane, adding a keyframe at the beginning and another at 100. Remember, transition durations can be set in GV Director via the radial menu. I'll click on the last keyframe and under the blending properties, set the opacity to 0. And I click on the keyframe button to update the keyframe with the new values. And if I play the timeline, I can see my simple mix transition. I could also create a wipe transition. So I use the Add Transition again and I'll rename it to Wipe. Now, I should at this point emphasize the fact that transitions must always be created as new items and not duplicated. This is because in duplicating the transition, you will be duplicating the front and back planes, and GV Director will be confused and you'll potentially have strange effects going on at transitions. Now, a wipe is going to be a little more complicated than a mix or a slide, because to get a wipe, you're effectively keying through from the front to the back. So we will need a key source. To apply this, I will open up my properties for the front plane, expand the materials, which is effectively the fill for the plane, double-click on Standard Texture, and under Players, you can see the fill is the mixer player and there's no key. I will click on the key box and from the Add Object pop-up window, select Gradient Plasma. If I click on the arrow or chevron here, then I see this is a black to white gradient, which we can use as our key signal. Back up to my standard texture and under keying, I'll make sure it's in test mode in the drop-down menu. And we will use the test max value for the keyframing. So I put a keyframe at the beginning of the timeline and one at 100 frames. And for the last keyframe, I'll set the test max to 0. So let's play the timeline. And there we have a horizontal wipe. Now what's interesting, if I go back to the gradient settings and change the angle to 90 degrees, and play back, we now have a vertical wipe. I could also set the soft max value in the keying area to 40 for both keyframes, play back, and guess what? We now have a soft wipe. We will look at exporting our Composer project as a production pack in a minute. But before we do that, let's build a compound element using the effect and transitions we just created. As I said in the introduction, a compound element is different from the other project items as it allows you to define a set of events that combines transitions and effects with placeholders for live feeds and shotbox clips. This is almost the same as you can do on the GV Director panel when you save the stage configuration as a compound element. Except in Composer, you can take it one step further and create multiple events separated by pauses or manual triggers. When would you use a compound element? Well, you could use it to replace a set of events that you perform repeatedly, such as displaying a scoreboard or showing what's coming next. You could also use it to create a complex set of multiple effects or transitions that will be impossible to trigger manually. So let's create a compound element to see the steps involved. I first click in the project window to add a compound element and rename it to Promo Compound, as I'll use the Promo Box effect within this compound element. Now double-clicking the item changes the timeline to the Compound Element timeline, and it opens up the Production Elements window. In the timeline, I first click to add a row or effects block. Then I add my elements to this block. So I'll start with the background video, and I can choose from either black, input for a live input, or shotbox. Now let's say I want a clip from my shotbox 2 position. So having selected shotbox, I can double click the element and can now select my shotbox location. So I'll set it to 2. Next, I'll add a transition. Let's add the mix transition. So I'll drag and drop it from my project window to the timeline. Next, I can add an effect. So this is where I can add my promo box effect by dragging it in the same way. If I double click the effect, I can select the action to perform, and in this case I'll choose the on action. Now remember that we assigned some scene parameters to this effect. Well, we can set up these too to test them, so let's enter some text. And click OK. So if you were setting up this compound element on the stage on the GV Director panel, then apart from adding more effects, this is as far as you could go. But on Composer, you can add more effect blocks like this. I could add a white next and set the background to input 1. Double-clicking the Input 1 box, I could choose any of the 8 live feeds if I want. Next, let's add the Promo Box effect again, but this time set it to the Off action. With multiple effect blocks, I have to decide how I will get from one block to the next. The default is set to User Pause, but double-clicking, you see I could set this to a timed pause of say 3 seconds. And now I can rehearse my compound element in the timeline like this. You can see the effect text I entered, and the placeholders for the shot box position 2 and live input 1. I can also duplicate the compound element and easily add and remove effects like this. Finally, these compound elements will appear in your GV Director panel under the Effects menu. Now remember, as part of your pre-production setup, you should always test new effects or compound elements that you create for your production pack in GV Director. So, although my project is a little limited in transitions and effects, I think I'm now ready to export the project as a production pack to my GV Director server. This is a very simple operation. All I need to do is go to the File menu to Export Project, and then either save it to disk to move the production pack manually, or choose to GV Director to send it direct to the server. I will FTP mine to the server. You connect to the server by entering the IP address in the window here. Click Next, then specify a folder name. Note you can only use a folder name once, so it's worth making them unique with a date or version number scheme. Then click Next again. And that's it, you're done. Now, a little side note here, remember when you save your Composer project, then it's worth saving it with a name or to a location so you know which production pack it refers to. You have seen that to create a production pack for a program from absolutely nothing means quite a bit of work. So you're more likely to begin with taking an existing production pack and modify it for your own needs. In the last part of this training, we will look at some further tips and tricks you may find useful when modifying a production pack for a new look or feel. The first thing to do is, of course, to either open up the associated Composer project or to import a production pack in order to convert it back to a local Composer project for editing. The Import Project command is in the Welcome window as well as in the File menu. We have a project open at the moment, so I'll go to the File menu and select Import. And remember, for GV Director, you should only pick the option From Disk. The From TXMAM Database option doesn't apply. It's for the Grass Valley K2Edge product. Now make sure you save the Composer project to an appropriate location. In this case, I'll leave it as my default project folder. This project is the same TV format, i.e. 1080-50i, as the previous project, so no restart was required. But if it had been different, then you would have seen a window asking if you want to restart. So this project has a complete suite of transitions like carousel, cube, flare wipes, mix and photo transitions. Then there are a host of templates to go along with the appropriate effects like the bug effect or clocks, lower third, promo, etc. In the object pane, if I take the filtering off, you can see all the objects associated with this project. And at the bottom of the list, under the mixer, all the transition layers. The animations here will have been used in the special animated transitions like the b-ball wipe and flare wipe. Revealing all objects in a project like this could be useful to you in building a new template using existing media, and that's because if you right-click here, then you can add to template. So for example, I could create a new template and then I could start by adding my logo and this Group 6 object, which contains the away team information, And if you look down here, if I dig down into the Group 6 object, then you can see it's actually been built from other objects. So this method saves me all the work of rebuilding the objects again. You might have noticed that for the template objects there are a lot of yellow warning triangles. These are indicating scene parameters have been set. If you want to check on the parameter names or to rename a scene parameter, then you can actually see them all in a scene parameters window. Now if the scene parameter window isn't open, then I go to the View menu, down to Windows, and Enable Scene Parameters. But it is already open, and it's down here nested with History and another useful window, Text Styles. So here are all my scene parameters, and you can right-click to rename or delete any of my scene parameters. Now what about this Text Styles tab I just mentioned? If I click on one of the styles, the Object Properties window over on the right of the screen here will show the settings for that style. And I can change all sorts of settings here, from the font, kerning, character width, to the alignment and the colour styling. Back at the top is where I can change the name of the style too. Over in the Text Styles window, at the top I can delete a style with the minus button, or I can create a new one with the plus button. Let's create a new style using the Big Noodle title font. I'll use the header style here, and it appears as a new style in the list called Header 3, and this is because someone has already created two headers before and they've defaulted to Header and Header 2. By clicking on the name, I see the properties over on the right. And here I can change the font to Big Noodle Titling. And change the name of the style too to something more meaningful rather than Header 3. And I'll call it Big Noodle. And there it's now in the styles list with the new name. Now I might know the other properties that I want to set the style to, but in this case I would like to see what I'm doing too. So I will load a template that has some text that I want to change and use this as a visual reference. I'll use the lower third in template and click on Text 2, and now in the properties I can click the radio button to use text styles and choose my new Big Noodle style. You can see the default text colour is white, which doesn't help us much here either. So I hover over the arrow or chevron next to the style selection box, and you can see it says Go to Text Style. Now the properties show me the settings for my text style, and I can see the changes in my template too. So let's change the face colour first so I can see what I'm doing. I want to use this blue here. I'll then set the font size to 45, align it left and centered vertically, and let's have a bit of drop shadow. So that's what I want for my new look, and let's apply the same style to the top line. So select the text and change the style to Big Noodle. And if I load the lower third out template, you can see the style has changed there too. Now I would recommend that after making changes to any in template, it's normally easier and safer to rebuild the out template using the duplicate and reverse keyframe method that we looked at earlier in the tutorial. But with a change like this, you may get away with using the existing out template. Now in my lower third template, what if I don't like my background image? Perhaps I want to change it for a different look. I need to expand my background group, and in Properties I can see the target file used was GVL3. I also see it's been keyframed. So I'll first have to remove the keyframe to change the image, otherwise it will remember it wants this background. So I click to delete the property keyframe, and now I can select a new image. It could be an image I just imported to the project assets. And I'll choose this graduated grey background here. Now let's play the lower third in. And we now have a whole new look for our lower third effect. If I click back on the lower third out template, then it still shows the old background image. And you'll notice in the properties, if I look at the still player, you see the player is set to no action. Compare this to the in template, where the player is set to play. So the out template being set to no action, it means it will let the still player continue with whatever was set in the in template. Let me go to the tryout mode to help show what's going on. And if I load the in template, and you see clicking on the out template doesn't revert the background to the original, it allows the image the in template loaded to continue playing, and it applies the keyframes to that new image. Let's come out of tryout mode again. So to fix the out template just to look right, even though it's behaving correctly, I could change the image by going to change the player to play, change the file to match the in template, and now that looks right. But I should change the player back to no action again so the whole effect still behaves correctly. This is another reason why it's probably less complicated to just duplicate the in template to make a new out template, then you know it'll be correct. Going into player actions was probably more than was warranted for this getting started tutorial. But if you'd like to know more about player actions or understand more of the Composer full feature set, then please take a look at the Composer user guide. That brings me to the end of this GV Director Composer tutorial. I hope you found it valuable, and if you haven't already done so, then please take a look at the other tutorials in this series. Well, that's all from me. Bye for now.